Hello, friends, and welcome to Montessori 101, a live show from Child of the Redwoods, all about the magic of Montessori. We believe that every child deserves a Montessori education. I'm Aubrey Hargis.
And I'm David Hargis. So if you are with us live, I see you out there. Good morning or afternoon or whatever the case might be. Or maybe you're listening to the replay or the podcast or whatever. We're just happy you have joined us on our Montessori adventure.
Yes.
And if you'd like to know more about our work, you can head over to our website, childoftheredwoods.com.
Yes. All right. Well, today we are talking about science experiments. And I am willing to bet that when you think about science experiments, something very specific comes to mind. What comes to mind for you? Because I just have an instant. I think about the lab coat. Do you think about the lab coat and the goggles?
Yeah.
The scientists
beakers and
beakers and things.
Yeah.
Right. So
a rigid process and
yes. So and maybe some overwhelm as well, or maybe even being in school at a lab, So what we are here to persuade you towards is actually loosening up with this whole concept of science experiments and understanding that science and parent experiments really underpin the Montessori method as a whole.
That's right.
They are not something that in Montessori we talk about a whole lot in the primary years, although we do talk about them a lot more specifically in lower elementary. But in the primary years, we're really, we integrate elements of science experiments into basically everything that the kids do in the Montessori method.
Yeah, the scientific method and scientific thinking it's a method of thinking, right? There are experiments, of course, and all those images we have of lab coats and I don't know, whatever your memories of being in a science class in high school, or maybe you have a memory of a TV scientist like Beekman or Mr. Wizard, who was big when I was a kid, or Bill Nye, I guess. Maybe that's your image, but kind of at a more basic level, what we're talking about with science and science experiments specifically is the method of thinking. It's a way of creatively problem solving and using, for little ones especially, physical, tactile kind of things to make change apparent to them. And that can really connect the dots. Like, I wonder what would happen. And then they do it and then they can see. And it helps make concrete this abstract process that they're going to, well, hopefully develop and rely on throughout their whole life. This process of problem solving and exploration.
Yeah. Kids love science experiments.
Yeah, they do.
At least we've noticed from our own children, they really love seeing magical things happen with physical things. They like the whole process of doing an experiment and finding out what happens and exploring. But they also test our boundaries of what we feel like is appropriate for a science experiment, or what we feel like qualifies for a science experiment. You could tell us in the chat if you know what we're talking about. Sometimes you try and do a Montessori lesson with your child or a classic science experiment, and it all becomes a complete disaster.
Yeah, that's right.
So we'll talk about where things go wrong and what not to do in an experiment. But first, let's kind of dig into, is that my phone or yours?
Speaking of science.
The
magic of science.
Something is buzzing. Where is it?
We're buzzing with the joy of science, I think is what.
We'll figure it out later, I guess. It's not my phone. Okay. Anyway. All right. I think this is actually a fun science experiment right now.
Okay.
I know where it came from.
Where? Upstairs. Yes.
It came from upstairs. Okay, so yes.
Experiment in acoustics, I suppose.
It's an acoustic.
Well,
our kids would love that, actually.
They would.
Okay, so science experiments can be very, very broad. Kids love them. They really love to see the physical properties of something change. So naturally, children will be curious when water freezes and
Hmm.
becomes ice. That's a point of curiosity for them. They will also be curious when that water goes into a pan and then disappears. Where does
Hmm.
it go? Evaporates. We know this now. We've got the vocabulary as adults to describe
Yeah.
what is happening. It changes into steam, it becomes a gas, but these are things that children don't necessarily know, and to them the whole world feels like magic. We don't need to do magic tricks in
Hmm.
order to get our children interested in life, or to have fun, or find joy in the mysterious nature of things. We don't have to I mean, magic is fun, right? The art of magic tricks are fun, especially for elementary kids.
Hmm.
But children don't need us to like pull out make our cartoon voices and put on the puppetry, as fun as it is, in order to find that joy in a science experiment. It can just be noticing the changes in the physical properties of things.
Well, this goes to Maria. We talked about I think it was last week, and talking about infantilize. We've talked about a bunch, not to infantilize a child, to let them. Yeah, it was when we were talking about imagination and the debate on imaginative play and Waldorf and Montessori and so forth. And our as what we said last week, and we've said many times, is that what Montessori encourages or requires us to do is not to infantilize a child, but to treat them with respect.
Right.
And so, if using the puppet is fun because it's an art form, or it gives you joy, or you just want to make it kind of different in the way that you would any kind of performance, that's great. But you don't need the puppet to mediate the science. That would be infantilizing. It would be like, oh, you're too little to understand what's happening.
Do see
and
a lot
so
of
I'm going
TV
to
shows do this.
so I'm going to like cartoonize this or puppet this or something,
Right.
because there's no way you can understand that when water gets hot, it turns to steam. And that's not true. In Montessori, we would say a child can understand that.
Or that they wouldn't be interested in it.
That's right.
Without all the
that's right. Or if we
things
didn't have all the cartoony stuff, it
Yeah.
wouldn't be interested. But a child can understand it and will be interested in that if they're developmentally ready.
That's
and if
right.
they're not developmentally ready, then don't give that lesson.
Also, children love to learn new vocabulary words.
They do.
And Maria Montessori tells us over and over and over in many different ways in all of the subject areas that we should be introducing the most complicated words to kids, not the most simple words, but the most complicated. And she believed this from everything from teaching children to write using the movable alphabet.
Mm-hmm.
Don't give them tiny words. Let them, dictate really long and big words, meaningful words to them, and let them try to hear the sounds in that. Because to a child, it doesn't matter whether a word is long or not.
That's right.
Yeah. And so what matters is the meaning of it. And so there's no reason why a child we have to dumb down our language when we're describing the properties of things for a child. Part of the interesting thing about science experiments is being exposed to those higher level vocabulary words, the opportunities that science experiments give us when working with children, and that they give children to seek new information about. So classic example of this would be we'll talk about our mushroom theme later, but I'm thinking specifically in our mushroom theme, using some words like absorbent and saturated. These are, usually like when we talk to a little child, we might say, that's right, the sponge is very full. It's full of water. And we might leave it at that. But in Montessori, we're really actually encouraged to think of more interesting vocabulary to share with the child. If we can get more scientific about what is happening, then that's all the better.
Yeah, that's right. And it's, it goes to the cup concept I've talked about many times. The child is like a cup. It'll hold as right. Their minds will hold as much as it can, and whatever it can't just flows out. And so filling it up with whatever you have is great. Don't
fill it up with coffee. Don't fill it up with coffee.
No, this is bad advice. No, whatever, but right. Give them give them real words, give them real concepts, and they'll absorb or take in, or their cup will fill to the point that it can. And it's, even if you have a very little one, let's say you've got a 2-year-old, and I know a lot of folks in our audience have 2, 3, and 4-year-olds. They're not very far away. By the age of, what is it, like 10 or 12, their brains are functioning in the way an adult, like a 12-year-old can know what an adult can know. A 10-year-old, I think, actually can know quite a bit close to what an adult can know. Now, can an adult outthink, quote unquote, a 12-year-old? Probably, because they have experience and age and
It's
wisdom,
the wisdom.
and yeah, they've learned tricks and
But
tips.
it's not
and
necessarily
they've
the
had
ability.
20, 30,
Yeah.
40, 50 more years to fill their head with facts and
Right.
things and make connections. But the processing power, the knowledge, a 12-year-old can do that. And we don't always think about that. And so, even if you have a 2, 3, or 4-year-old, they're already well along the journey to that. Within a few years, they're going to have a mind that is capable of adult thinking.
Yes.
Even if they don't have the maturity to display that or process it or the wisdom yet, the brain is there, it's ready. And that's part of this, what Montessori is about, is like we give kids real things to work with because their brains deserve it. And it's really exciting to them. And you're not going to break them. In fact, it's worse to cartoonize everything than it is to overly scientificize everything.
Yes.
If you were to give them that, and then that's the inverse of how we usually think about how we treat children in our society, and that's a problem. And so, as Montessorians, or as people interested in Montessori, that's a challenge for you. We love childlike things. I love toys. I love Disneyland, and I love all the stuff that we associate with childhood and children, and puppets and all that stuff, right? But that's fine. I'm an adult, and a child can enjoy those things just as much as an adult can. Those aren't necessarily just the domain of children. They are art forms, or they give us joy for one reason or another. And the inverse is true. The child can be just as excited by big concepts as you, the adult. And so don't, I guess the point is, like, don't think that the world of childhood is separate and somehow diminished from the world of adulthood. It's a spectrum, a continuum. And don't fall into the trap of the child isn't ready for certain things.
Yeah. I think we should also bring up the fact that when we are doing a science experiment, it is innately hands-on. And we did a whole episode about hands-on learning. So if you want to go deeper into that, go find that episode on YouTube.
Totally.
Yes, but the biggest benefit of hands-on learning, I mean, there are so many that we listed in that one episode, but it actually does strengthen their memory.
Mm-hmm.
And it helps them to make connections between concepts. So imagine you're doing, you're exploring the physical world with your child. We can call it an experiment. We can just call it a lesson, whatever. Basically, every Montessori lesson is pretty much a science experiment of one kind or another.
That's
but
right.
This gives you a common language to talk to your child about. When you are out and about in the world, you can make that connection back to this experience that you shared together. And same when you come home and you have an experience together, you can make a connection back, into nature or wherever, you were at that museum. Do you remember when we, you're at the museum, you're like, do you remember at home when we, and so you're helping your child to really see the whole world as their classroom. And the more connections, I think, this is something that we really work to do as parents.
Yep.
And we actually were very conscious about it as parents. And also, David and I have been teachers for a long time, and it's just good teaching. And so I really wish it's not easy to do it, but I wish more parents would understand the value of helping to make those connections between subject areas, which is one of the whole reasons why we have Constellation, which is, we put forth a new theme every single month that integrates the subject areas. But you can do this, and you should be doing this in your regular life too.
Thematic lesson planning is totally doable. And
yes, but also it doesn't have to be formal.
It doesn't.
No,
that's
you
right.
can embark if you're just embarking on this life. You're at the you're at the beach. If you live here in San Francisco or on the coast, like you go to the beach or I don't know, whatever beach you're near, if you are near a beach. But we grew up in Texas where there weren't any beaches.
That's right.
We had to drive a long way to get to a beach.
Lakes, you could go
So
to
I'm
the
always
lake.
thinking about that. But here, maybe you're at the beach, you see a sand dollar, you make a connection like, what shape is it? And then you come home and then you open up the geometry cabinet and you're like, oh, it's the same shape as the sand dollar, you know? Or maybe you go to the beach and you see a whole bunch of sand dollars, have a whole bunch of those on our particular beach. And maybe because you have been doing activities, ordering things by size at home, maybe you're at the beach and you're like, oh, I noticed this one is smaller than that one, and that one is even smaller. And you start to line them up. And then your child is like, makes that connection between the geometry work that you've been doing at home and what they're experiencing out on this adventure with
That's
you.
right.
And so the more you can help your child make those connections. That's just one of many, many, many examples. The more you can bridge the connection between subject areas and between experiences, the more brain cells your child is going to grow.
Totally.
I mean, that's just the way learning works. Like, what is literally happening when you make those connections? Why do we encourage a thematic approach to learning alongside, teaching, more also
the foundational
the
concepts.
foundational lessons? Okay, why do we do that? Because we know scientifically, we know pedagogically that when we bridge these concepts across the curriculum areas, your child's neurons are literally expanding. Like those dendrites are literally growing. And I've never seen a dendrite, friends, other than in pictures of the brains.
Sure.
But we know that it is real. And we know that they are formed, and that during the years under the age of 12, they are just growing exponentially.
Fast,
yeah. And so your whole purpose is, to allow your child to enter into this beautiful organic process of making connections.
That's right.
And experiments help your child. The more you take your learning journey with the mindset of, we're doing an experiment with everything, we're seeing everything as a potential experiment, the more connections your child is going to make, and just the learning blossoms. It's just so awesome. And we can do all of this without pressure. And that's the amazing thing, is when you don't take the perspective of, just helping your child make these beautiful organic connections between things. If you were to take a more rigid approach, I know that we get parents coming to us at Child of the Redwoods saying, well, I'm looking for a day-to-day lesson plan, that tells me what to do every single day in every single subject. And if you did that, it might make you feel more organized. But
you could check things off.
You're missing the organic nature of learning, so learning, as we've said time and time again, tasks, having checklists is fun and it can help us feel organized, but learning itself is not a series of checklists. Your child is not checking off things that they are learning. They're bouncing around, making connections. Hello, Daniela. Good to see you.
Yes, welcome. I know you're in Texas. I don't know if you got to see the eclipse yesterday. My mother,
you have to tell me,
still lives in my hometown.
Talk about an experiment. I know Daniela said it was cloudy yesterday.
No.
So let us know in the comments if you were able to see the eclipse.
Talk about science, right? That's an amazing moment of science.
Yes.
For a lot of folks in the U.S.
There's lots of opportunities in the world that we can take to have little impromptu, spontaneous experiments.
Yeah, so I was thinking, I know we're going to go into like how not to do an experiment, because the bottom line is we overcomplicate it. So to kind of transition into that, the thought I had, because we were talking about water and so forth, is you walk outside in the morning and there's dew on the grass.
Yeah.
Where does that dew come from? And what about fall here?
You know what happens here? I had never seen this. Danielle, I don't know if you'll have seen this in Texas or not, but when we moved here to San Francisco, it was the first time that regularly I saw like deadwood steam.
Yes.
And that blew my mind. It even happens with our wooden fence out here during certain seasons. Like the fog will come in overnight and then the fog will burn off. And as it's burning off or receding, and when the sun comes out, there's like this moment where fog is going away and the sun is shining brightly. And then like the woods like give off their moisture
Well,
and
you
it's
can
visible. It's
recreate,
wild.
you probably recreate this
Mm,
every day in your
is
house.
that right? Oh, when you shower,
When you cook.
when you cook,
Yeah, when you boil water. I mean, it's just what you're seeing is a variation on
steam,
steam,
right? It's
right?
steam.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so this is the
But it's
point.
not boiling.
No, it's not. But
But it's so cool.
it's something that you can read. So this is where you can kind of get to the creativity. Like, where did the dew come from, or where's the steamy sort of vapor coming from off this log? Now the sun is hitting it. Oh, remember when we made boiled eggs yesterday, and the steam, or we
Mm,
made spaghetti or whatever, and the steam was
right.
coming up? That was also water. And then this can lead into, depending on the age of the child, you can go in a lot of different directions, but you're starting to connect the dots. And the real underlying thing here is like there's a natural phenomena. Matter has different states depending on how it's affected by external
Yes.
forces like heat or coldness. And we can observe that change. And then that can lead to the question of like, why is there dew in the morning but not in the afternoon? Or why it's so sunny right now, but suddenly this log in the woods is starting to steam? Why is it? Oh, it's because the sun has
And
now
where it's like it
passed.
feels cold,
Yeah, like
right?
it's because the sun is like passed out of the shadow and now it's warming it up. And this is the same
Mhm.
phenomena. And your child can get really, really excited by that.
Mhm.
And it can lead to a whole world of thinking that leads to all sorts of stuff like, well, I don't know, like what kinds of animals would evolve to live in dark places or creatures or otherwise, like, for example, mushrooms. Like, what is it about the way that the science of our universe works that is conducive to different types of life? And this is a thought that's a kind of a big thought, but it's not the sort of thought you should shy away from. Your littlest ones are not going to get it necessarily because they're still learning in a more of a concrete way, but they'll take it in. And as you continue to have these conversations and thinking aloud as they get older, it will start to click. And before too long, by the time they're in that lower elementary range, they're going to start to get really excited. And they're going to know if it really connects to them, they're probably going to know a lot more about it than you do
Yeah.
very quickly.
That's for sure. Yeah. I think we especially see that with children around the age of 6.
Yeah.
Because they get a lot more verbal during that time and they have had the opportunity during their if they've had the opportunity during their preschool years, that's when you really see, I know that a lot of our parents of 3s and 4s are like, I don't know if my child is getting this, or the learning seems so slow
Mhm.
at times. But by the time you get to kindergarten, first grade age, I think you kind of get this windfall
Yeah.
of like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
So like everything that we did during the last 6 years actually really like came together and they just have this immense wealth of knowledge. It's really
Totally.
cool.
Well, we have this experience all the time as parents where the words that we say in private that we assume would not be understood come back to us in
Yeah.
little mouths. And we're like, who taught you that? I bet it was your father.
Most times this.
But it is little ears, little ears are hearing. And so we know this is true. They're always aware. And so, let's give them good stuff.
Yeah. Brooke says the eclipse was amazing.
Yeah.
Their entire school got to see it. Oh, the clouds parted just in time. Beautiful. And Daniela also got to see it.
Sky cleared out just at the right moment. That's what my mother was saying.
Amazing.
Apparently it really was fantastic. So
Yeah.
I am jealous.
I know. I was reminiscing about the 2017 eclipse in Texas that I just happened to be visiting my parents.
But this
and got
was
to see.
much more dramatic. This was a full total eclipse.
This was amazing. Yes, I have heard.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh well.
Oh well.
It'll happen again.
Yes, it will.
It's 25 years or something. Anyway, all right. Let's talk about experiments.
Okay, hang on.
Oh yes.
I wanna run through some points about what not to do.
Oh yes.
With some tips. Is that
Yes.
okay?
Let's talk about what not to do for an experiment.
Okay, and then we'll give some examples of experiments.
Yeah, great.
Okay, so I don't know if you have seen those big experiment books, like 300 science experiments you could do with your child right now, or the big boxes of science experiments. The problem that most parents have when they open those things up is they realize, oh, okay, so I want to do these experiments. I've got these things bookmarked. Oh, now I realize that I have a list of 50 to 75 teeny tiny things that are supposed to be household objects.
Yeah.
And also some specialty science equipment things that I'll have to order in order to do these experiments. And friends, that is like when I back out. Like that, I have tried many times to like, okay, all I got to do is this. Now I'm going to order all this stuff. And I get on the website and then like, it just feels so overwhelming. I'm like, how many beakers do we really need? Do I just need one? I don't know. I add a bunch of stuff to my cart. And then just even these very, very simple experiments that the concept may not require all of this stuff. But that's the breaking point for me.
Yeah, I was thinking kind of the inverse, but also I think exactly the same thing is nowadays they sell kits that will do a specific kind of experiment.
Yes.
You can make elephant toothpaste or whatever.
Right.
And it has just enough chemicals to make that one experiment.
And then it's done. Right.
Yeah. So they're like, oh, you don't have to go buy all the stuff. We're going to give it to you. But it's a one shot thing. Like, and
then you throw the box away.
Yeah. So now you bought something. It's probably kind of expensive. You do it one time. You open up the box. It's always the same level of disappointment. Like, this is what was in here. There's a paper clip and a ball, like, this is what I spent my money on. Thanks. So yeah. And then you do it one time and they can't, and that's it. Like, if you want to recreate it, you don't get to
repeat it.
You got to go buy more stuff or buy another kid. Or I guess it's fun in the sense of like, you can make that thing happen, but it's like buying a box of like a cake mix, right? Make a cake, but if you want to learn how to make cakes, you've got to like buy the ingredients and go through the process and make lots and lots and lots of cakes, some of which will be better than others, until eventually you figure out how to do it. It's a lot harder than going and buying the box of Duck and Heinz and making that cake, but it's a wholly different experience. And so what we're arguing here would be the big giant book where you have to go have 1,000, different little tiny, like, go get the tiniest kind of paper clips. And now you need this much string, but it's got to be this weight. Is that, or the opposite side, which is like, buy the box and it's got everything you want, but it is at one time. Neither one of those are really practical. They are overly complicated in their own ways.
I think there's a certain small selection of people that can do it and really loves it. But I think that for most of us parents at home, I think like if you were teaching science, say you're like a second grade science teacher and that's all you do, and you've got a big closet full of science experiments, equipment, then you're all basically kind of set up and that's your job, is just science experiments. But as a parent at home, a lot of our families have a little toddler running around in the mix as well, and an older child. And so if you're experiencing that kind of overwhelm with the big book or the box or whatever, then just don't do it.
Yeah, I'm more cynical, I suppose. I think it's more, for me, it's that we, in our culture, we know that we don't want to just give kids cartoons all the time. So we want to give them healthy snacks.
Yes. Okay. So let's load them up with experiments.
Yeah. So this is good for you, but it's the PBS Kids model. Like, it is better than, Punch Kick Fighter or whatever, but it's still passive entertainment. It's like Baby Einsteins or whatever. Like, if you really want, Baby Mozart, just play Mozart. You don't need to buy the themed thing.
Yeah.
And if you want to do science experiments, you can do them at home. Like, your world is filled with natural experiments.
Yeah. There's really only one thing you need. I am going to argue that you would need in order to do a science experiment. And that is just to wonder something. Like, curiosity. I wonder what would happen if, and then like try and try and do that thing, and you can do that thing with any of the household things that you already have. I wonder what would happen if we covered it with aluminum foil. I wonder what would happen if we put this thing outside. I wonder what would happen if we tried to stack them. I wonder what would happen if we tried to mash them with our feet, or if we squeezed it, or
Mhm.
you know.
Yep.
So, and I'm thinking about mushrooms, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, you can't do that with everything.
No.
But yeah, like the curiosity is the real experiment.
That's right. And so you don't need a great big book or even a box with like one-time use materials to do that.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Almost everybody has baking soda and vinegar at home, and that can be used for so many curious
Totally.
explorations very safely. I would also argue on the topic of how not to do an experiment is that a lot of us in school were taught that the only way we should do a science experiment is with a lab sheet.
Yes,
That
very rigid.
If it's not with a lab sheet and we don't fill in all the little boxes and we don't write down everything first, then it's not an experiment,
That's right.
And I actually in school, I actually in my teacher education program in college, I had a fabulous science teacher who taught me how to teach science. And it was all about discovery learning, which is very Montessori science aligned. And he was a great instructor. But then once I got into the public school system, I was explicitly taught never to do a science experiment without filling out the entire scientific method process on a sheet.
Yep.
Like that every experiment had to have a sheet. And if it didn't, it wasn't science. And that is coming from a school system. So, in Montessori, we just reject the whole thing. Like you don't even see lab sheets until the elementary years in most cases.
Yeah. I'm thinking about
unless they're just for us to model or observe with. Sometimes we include them in our activities, but we also serve ages 2 to 9.
Sure. I'm listening to you. It occurs to me that this is where it gets complicated, because earlier in this video we said that I said, like, why do you do science? Because it is teaching them scientific thinking. And so it's logical to say, oh, okay, well, then you must use the lab sheet because you're reinforcing that.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're saying, like, no, don't get hung on that. It's kind of similar to where earlier we were saying, don't infantilize children, give them real things. And then we're saying, like, don't give them the book of 300 experiments. Like, well, which is it? Don't give them real things. Like, those are real things. So should I do that? And yeah, I think it's the purpose. It always comes down to the intent, the intention. So I think, for example, with the lab sheet for an older child, they might find it really rewarding to write it down. And the reason scientists
also because they might be, if they're in a stage where they're practicing writing and they're getting more confident with a pencil, it gives them it can give them some structure. So, I would say the bigger benefit of a lab sheet for an elementary child is that it gives them some limited structure of like some fill in the blanks so that they can be writing without it being too intimidating. Like you're not requiring them to write like whole paper, right?
That's right.
They're just filling in some things and documenting and observing. And even children who are learning how to write might enjoy that. They might enjoy, if they're learning how to write with a pencil, they might enjoy, thinking of the sounds that make the words that they want to say.
But that goes to the purpose. That's the intent, right? And that's the key. So a scientist, I'm not a scientist, but I've done other kinds of work, and I could tell you that the reason you use the template is because you have an actual need. So I use my lab sheet or whatever, my notes document, to capture information because I need to record it, not because there's a box there that I have to fill in, right? And so the intention of the lab process and the scientific process is to help structure your work so that it's replicable. It's not to say fill out these 5, 6, 7 check boxes. Now, the boxes can be useful to guide your work. And like you said, there can be other purposes, especially at the school level, but
Yeah.
the purpose of the experiment is not to fill out the lab sheet.
Right.
The purpose of the experiment is to do the experiment, and you use the lab sheet, if there is one, to help document what you're doing or seeing so that you can reflect on that later. And then go back to your notes and say, oh, I see when I did this, this happened, and I wonder if I can replicate it. So it's always about the intent. Same thing with like the big box. Like you buy the box or the big book, right? It's got 300 experiments. Did you buy the big book? In my experience, when you get somebody buys a book of 300 experiments, a lot of times it's because they don't know what else to buy the kid. Like it's like, well, you're too old for this, so I'm going to buy you the big book instead. It's like it's healthy, like it's a better gift or something, and then it sits on the shelf, right? Maybe the kids get it out, or maybe they don't, or maybe they get excited about it and they bring it to you and they're like, oh, let's do this together, and you're like, oh, too much stuff. Or the same with like the boxes, like you buy the kit box. So is the intent to actually because you want the child to have the experience of doing these experiments, or is it because you needed to give them something for that moment, or you went to the museum and they saw the stuff on the shelf and they got really excited and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, let's have a souvenir, but I don't want to buy you this stuffed animal. I want to buy you this science kit because it's better for you.
Yeah.
Like, what is your purpose? Is your purpose to teach that concept, or is it to check some other box? And I think that's the rub, right? That's how you find the difference between filling the child to infantilize them, but not to overly, but to like, we don't want you to infantilize, but we also don't want you to go off and buy a bunch of science kits because it's about your purpose. It's always about the intent.
You could buy a science kit if it's purposeful.
Exactly.
I mean, for example,
that's right.
I know a lot of our parents bought a mushroom growing kit because we just put forth this theme mushroom. And this is actually a new theme. It's not in the shop. It's just only in Constellation for members right now. But a mushroom kit is not actually in the unit.
Nope.
But it is something that a lot of our members realize, hey, actually Target has a mushroom kit for under $10 and it goes with our mushrooms and we can actually grow some mushrooms and like, that's a great kit.
Yep.
Okay. But the aisle of like educational science experiment kits, in our experience, they just aren't that great.
Yeah.
It really has to be like, it has to be intentional. Like for our rocks and minerals unit, we had Adorn, the rocks and minerals unit, thematic unit. And a lot of our members went and found a kit about rocks and minerals, and that gave them some supplies to add to their Montessori work. And that's great, right? So we're not totally
the intention
against,
is aligned with the material.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we're not saying never buy that stuff or whatever. It's always, be purposeful. Be purposeful in your life with your child and yourself. Yeah.
Okay. I want to say a note about the hypothesis.
I hear you, Danielle.
Yeah, I was also going to say guilty you and like every other parent.
Yes. You go to the zoo and you could either buy this pencil with the orca, or you could buy this book that has the display of, like.
I know. Yes.
It's hard just to say, like, we're not going to buy anything, right? Because
it's really hard to say that in a gift shop.
It is.
Okay. I want to say a word about the hypothesis. This is something I was also taught that kids were supposed to write down or actually do every single time there was a science experiment. And maybe it's because, if you skip forward another 18 years, like you're an actual scientist in a lab doing lab work, maybe the hypothesis is a really important part of a study, doing a study. But I'm arguing that the hypothesis is important. That's where you make a guess about what's going to happen in your experiment. But I think that it can be really unfun when you force a child to decide and predict. And so I think a better approach, instead of saying, okay, what do you think is going to happen? And they're like, I don't know what's going to happen. They actually might not have any idea what is going to happen or be able to choose, at this young age. They might just be more interested in the observation that is going to happen.
Yeah, because unlike a real scientist, they didn't come upon this hypothesis by studying a phenomenon and then like, what's causing this, right? It's artificially created for them.
Right. So, just not to say that it's not important to ask children what do you think is going to happen, and have a conversation about it. It is important.
Totally.
But I think it's best done orally at this young age, just like, oh, wow, do you think it's going to get bigger? You can give them ideas. Like, do you think it's going to get bigger or smaller? And they're like, I don't know. And you're like, I don't know either. Maybe bigger because, I don't know, it could get more moisture, or I don't know. And you're just brainstorming with them and using it as an opportunity to chat, to use your vocabulary words that might be important in the results, and to kind of get creative with your imagining what's going to happen. And sometimes it's fun. I know this might sound silly, but sometimes it's fun to imagine the result of the experiment as something very fantastical. Children are very, very good at this. We talked about this in our imagination episode last week, which go catch that if you didn't watch that one, because it definitely relates in this way. But I don't know any scientist who would write up a real scientific study and say, like, I think the mushroom is going to explode, right? When it's put into water. Like, that's probably not an assumption that
because they're old enough
gonna make,
to have seen what happens in general.
Right. You have some experience with mushrooms anyway, but your child might not know. They might actually think that it's fun to dream up, like, yeah, it's gonna explode, or I don't know, it's gonna start growing more fungus, or another mushroom is gonna pop out, or
That's right.
I don't know. You can get fun with that too, and show them how, like, it's okay to be playful and be creative, or I don't know. So I'm just throwing that one out there because I think a lot of people think that the hypothesis needs to be definitely, I was taught it needed to be confirmed. Like, yes, I do think it is going to absorb more, or I do not, right? Like, kind of serious and boring.
Write this in this very
we're going to
specific,
write it down in this little
appropriate
box,
language or whatever.
Right. But a hypothesis is, it's just like, it's an opportunity for dreaming big and fantastically. And that part really speaks to little kids. And if they're not in a period where they want to do it with you, don't push it. Like, they actually literally might not know and might be feeling too curious about what's going to happen, or too nervous about it in order to really enjoy the hypothesis apart.
Yeah. So I might even say, so we have a mushroom absorbency experiment in here, and you have the mushroom absorb the water, and then you weigh it before and after. But you might not have them fill out anything at first. You might just say, let's see what happens, and then see what happens. It's going to absorb the water. It's going to be heavier. And then depending on the age of the child,
maybe you're just like squeezing it at first to see if it got more water in it.
Right. You're not even doing the scale. That's great. Right. And then you might say that, but they might lead them to wonder, like, I wonder what else could it be absorbed by that mushroom. And
one of our members' kids did that. I don't know if you saw that in a group. Yeah, I think Cecily's son picked up the mushroom and like squeezed it and realized drops.
Yeah, there's a tactile experience.
And I don't know if there was a moment where they were like, what do you think will happen when we squeeze the mushroom? I'm going to have to ask her.
Or maybe it just came into the child's mind.
Maybe it was just like, I feel the urge to do this thing to this mushroom and then see, so it doesn't have to be formal.
No, it doesn't. But it could then lead to something more formal, right? That could be the, like, what happens if we use vinegar in water? What happens if we use hot water versus cold water? And that's then where a lab sheet becomes useful, because you want to remember what you did and remember what happened.
What if we plant this mushroom?
Yeah, what happens if I plant this mushroom?
Will it grow?
Yeah. I don't know. And so the first swing at it, it may not be that you're writing really anything down. You're just seeing what happens. You're taking advantage of that curiosity. And then if it sparks with the child, then you can start to add a little bit more structure, or you can start to bring in tools. Like, we have these things that scientists use. They're called lab sheets, or they're notes, or observation notes, or whatever. And we use them when we want to do this. Do you want to see what happens now if we do this instead? And they're like, yeah. Then great, you've got a hit, and you're able to naturally introduce it. This would also be a time when you would maybe go buy one of those kits or whatever, like you said, the mushroom growing kit, or you're at the zoo or whatever, and you see the little fun buy and do this experiment kit.
Yeah, one of our members is going to do yeast because it's also fungi,
Yeah.
like mushrooms are, and
Yeah.
that doesn't take in like go buy a little package of yeast.
So this just goes back to the
water.
intent, though. Like, so the child is showing a real interest in it, and you see that something that could, add to that, a book, an experiment, or something. Fine, like your intention is good. It's aligned with the child's interest. If your intent is just sort of like, well, if you need to feel this obligation to give you something, then that's where it tends to just wind up in the Goodwill box.
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. So those are how experiments can go wrong, right? We spend too much time on the hypothesis. We overly complicate. We don't, we make it too big or like rigid for the child. How would you suggest we do good experiments with?
All right. Yeah. Let's end with that. So to do a good experiment, think outside the box. I would say don't be afraid to fail.
Yep.
Failure is really, really good in any experiment. I would also say broaden your definition of a science experiment. I mean, even something like the pink tower, like these classic Montessori materials that we give children. I mean, this is primed for experimentation.
Yep.
And in fact, that is what we want our children to do with it, is to experiment with it and see what happens. They're going to stack it in different ways and see what it looks like, and visually assess it and feel it,
weigh them.
Yeah. So and I was thinking about pouring. A lot of people think about the Montessori method. They think, pouring with cute little pictures, and it is adorable and fun and a very classic activity, but it's also an experiment, because you're experimenting with gravity, and you're experimenting with balance, and your muscle motor control. You're also kind of experimenting with different things. Often children will not pour it into the pitcher; they'll like pour it outside of the pitcher, and so maybe you're experimenting with like volume, like how objects can fill different containers differently. So I know a lot of children like to do this, and it can be kind of frustrating for the parent. But like, instead of pouring it into the other pitcher, they will pour it onto the tray. And then of course, it just like the beans are everywhere, the oatmeal's everywhere. And to the parent, they're like, the child didn't do what they were supposed to do, which is to pour it into the other pitcher, which is the Montessori activity that, was put forth by the Montessori community, Montessori guides. But what they did do is they did an experiment, and they wanted to know what would happen if they put the same, is it called volume? The same volume of beans that is in this one container, and see what it looks like in this differently shaped.
I'm looking
container.
at your jar collection over here, and you have some that are bumpy, like that one there. This might have exactly the same volume as, let's say, that little bottle. But as so the child might find it fun to pour the materials from one bottle to the next to see if the volume is the same. And they may start by pouring it on the tray itself, just to sort of look at it, in detail.
In Montessori, we can give children the invitation to do these experiments, but they are a little more open-ended than I think we tend to think of as an experiment.
Yeah, because where's your hypothesis? Where's your lab sheet?
Or where are your beakers and your goggles and, your chemicals and stuff.
That's
like we think, or I'm also thinking of like, the experiment where you have like, you're supposed to get like a soda bottle, like plastic soda bottle, and put a balloon around it, or I don't know, you put a match inside or something, and it blows up the balloon. I have never been able to get that thing to work. Like, I tried several times with our kids, just like, I don't know, maybe we did get it to work, but it wasn't fun for me because there were so many parts involved, and it just
and that you're supposed to get an outcome. It's not like a real experiment where you're doing the experiment because you want to try and understand what could happen.
Right.
In this case, you're just trying to recreate
someone else's experiment.
When you put this and this together, this happens.
And then you're right about the outcome. Like in those science experiments books, they always give you a very clear objective, what you are learning in the science experiment
Yeah.
and what your child will learn in the end, like what the results is,
That's right.
and then how to interpret the results of the
Oil
experiment.
and water will not mix.
Right. But a real experiment is like experimenting, and experimentation
right.
to a child is play.
Exactly right.
All right, that's where we're wrapping up today.
All right. The last thing I was going to add, I'm sorry, because we were talking about this natural, the thing that this is like, okay, we're pouring this, and how's that? In the lower elementary curriculum, the first great lesson is the coming of the universe. And in part, what that story is about is that the universe is filled with natural law. It is made from natural law and order. And there are constant truths about the universe that some of which we can measure with our science, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like volume or gravity or thermodynamics or wind resistance, right? These are concepts that are discussed in that first grade lesson, which you give to young children as a way of sort of underpinning that before there was humanity, there was natural law, there was the universe, and we can see those irreconcilably true things about the universe even today when we do experiments like pouring the sand into one to the other. Like, there's gravity, there's volume, there's things that were necessary to the making of our whole universe. And it's essential to the Montessori approach to learning that we kind of orient ourselves around, like, there is something, whatever you want to think of it as, but there is something greater than an individual person. And we're all sort of living within this universe, which is governed by laws and rules that came well before we did. And it's an amazing way to start to transition that child as they're seeing things working into that deeper understanding about how like life is. And it's one of the beautiful things about the Montessori curriculum.
It is.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Oh, then thanks everyone for showing up. Thank you, Daniela, for all your good comments. We will be back in a week, I believe. Are we back next week?
I think so.
Oh, good.
I don't know why we wouldn't.
Why wouldn't we be? I don't know. So we will see you next week. If you want to know more about our work, head over to our website, childoftheredwoods.com. You can email us at hello@childoftheredwoods.com. We have a little instant message feature on our website as well that we try and get to as often as possible. So if you have a question that you want to get more like conversational with, you can reach us there. Otherwise, we hope to see you here next week.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Okay. Bye.